Good afternoon and welcome to the pre-recording of topic 9. Today in general we will be looking at advanced programming plus a few other topics. As you can see in this slide, we will also be looking at programmable automation controllers, which is a major influence in automation today. But we'll start off with program optimization and some techniques that can be used in implementing program optimization. Of course, there is no substitute for experience, but there are a few pointers. Right, so we start off with the KISS principle, which is an acronym for Keep It Simple, Simon. That is just an industry standard way of saying that you need to do things in a way that is elementary and easy to understand, because that will probably also be the way in which it is best implemented. That says that programs that are simply conceived and clearly laid out are usually much easier to understand in future. Well, think of it this way. It will not always be you and you only that look at your own program, but in future years, somebody else will need to maintain what you have created. And when it is simply conceived and clearly laid out, it will just be that much easier for somebody in future to do troubleshooting on the program you wrote. When programs become cumbersome, they take up too much space in terms of storage, take up too much scan time. They have usually a large number of similar functions, or communications can become way too slow. When you find any of these, then introduce more compact coding techniques, which will reduce the size, the scan time, and the complexity of your software. And that's the KISS principle in a nutshell. Well, to assist in beginning to understand what the KISS principle is all about, we will be looking at these few techniques that can be employed. And we start off with timing ticks, followed by multiplexing and encoding, decoding techniques, and a universal state-based design. However, the universal state-based design will be dealt with in your tutorial. So we will only be looking at numbers 1 to 3 in the pre-recordings. So the purpose of timing ticks is to perform a very slow process once in every number of scan cycles. Tn is the time in which you want to perform that slow process, and that is far slower than one single scan cycle of your PLC. So let's look at an example. Say, for instance, your PLC scan time is 100 milliseconds. That means that every 100 milliseconds, a new scan cycle will be started by your PLC, and the software that you've given it linked to that scan cycle will be executed every 100 milliseconds. Now, let's say you want to do some other work in 5 seconds, 10 minutes, and 2 hours apart. And that is very much longer than a single scan cycle. Now, in order to make it more real, let's say every 5 seconds, that would be T1. You want to toggle output to generate a flashing annunciator light. In other words, a flashing light that draws your attention. Every 10 minutes, you want to check the water level in a dam to to see if it already overflows. And typically in such a dam, these are large dams, it would take several days to fill the dam. So to check every 10 minutes is actually already a bit over the top. And the third one, every 2 hours, check an input from a very slow process. The problem is that you cannot guarantee an exact time delay, Tn. You will have some timing jitter in the process that we propose of about 1 scan cycle time. In other words, an uncertainty of 1 scan cycle time of 100 milliseconds, in other words, which between you and me is negligible. So I'm not even going to say much about that. The timing that you require can be related to the scan cycle time. The scan cycle time we've set as an example is 100 milliseconds. Now, T1, which is 5 seconds, would then constitute 50 scan cycles. And T2, 10 minutes, would be roughly 6,000 scan cycles. And T3, which is 2 hours, 72,000 scan cycles. Now, the worst solution that you can do is to count the scan cycles. So you sit within the scan cycle and you keep a counter which you pulse every time that you go into the scan cycle, and you count 56,000 or 72,000 of these scan cycles, and then you perform each of these operations. Yeah, it can work. The downside is that when you need to change the scan cycle timing, everything changes. All timing will change because you count the amount of scan cycles, and when you change the scan cycle time, it upsets everything that you've built so far. So the better solution is to generate timing ticks. And the way in which you go about it is to find the smallest of these times that you wish to delay. Now, if you look at T1, 2, and 3, it's obvious that the smallest of these is 5 seconds. If you now divide that 5 seconds by some chosen integer, and let's call it x, then x is a granularity of your time base. So if you choose to divide by m equal 5, then the granularity of the time base that you have now chosen to create would be 1 second. All that means in practice is that you would not be able to time more accurate than 1 second. In other words, if any of T1, 2, or 3 was less than 1 second, it would not work. However, as you started to choose, you already had the smallest of them, which you divided by some integer. So no harm done. There will not be any of the T1, 2, or 3, or any of the times that you have, which would be smaller than your granularity. The timing jitter, in other words, the uncertainty around the 1 second time base that you now create, would be 1 scan cycle. Why? Because in some instances, you can have that time run out just after completing the current scan cycle, and you can only pick it up in the next scan cycle. Or you can have it run out in the beginning of a scan cycle and deal with it directly. So at worst, you will be out by about 1 scan cycle, which is in this case, in this example, 100 milliseconds. Now I've chosen the integer by which I divide the smallest time somewhat arbitrary. But note that you should choose this large enough so that you do not cause overflow of your counter variable on your longest delay, which in this example is 2 hours. And you should also choose it small enough to have enough counts before reaching your smallest time. If you choose that to be only one, in other words, if in this example over here you chose M to be such that you would only have one count and you're at 5 seconds, then you may miss that 5 seconds and you may have a bad experience on that. So M should be somewhere between not having overflow on the longest time and giving you some counts on the smallest time. In this example, M was chosen well. There's no problem. Right, so now you set up a timer to produce one tick every 1 second. 1 second was a resolution that you now have chosen for your timing tick. So every 1 second, you want to have a timing tick. So to delay 1 second will be one timing tick. 1 minute will be 60 of them, and 1 hour will be 3,600 of them. So that for 2 hours, you will have to delay 7,200 counts. 10 minutes, 600 counts, and for 5 seconds, 5 counts. And now you need to assign a hold register. Remember, a holding register is also a 8 or 16 or 32-bit variable. In this case, we chose to be using a uint, which is an unsigned integer. And an unsigned integer register is 16 bits long. Now, because it's unsigned, we can use the whole 16 bits for the magnitude, and therefore we can have 65,536 counts in an unsigned integer register of 16 bits, because 2 to the power of 16 gives you 65,536 counts. So 1 second will eventually lead to a maximum count of 65,536 seconds, which will be 18.2 hours, which is ample, because if you look at the maximum requirement, your maximum requirement is 2 hours. So you are about 9 times more comfortable in choosing a 16-bit register than you need to have. Right. So the only requirement is that the width of your register must be such that 2 to the power of the width of your register, which is given as y here, times your time base, which is 1 second in this case, must be larger than the maximum time you wish to count. In this example, as we've seen, we exceed this by about 9 times. So we have ample range in a uint in this example. Right, now just to make things easier, for every one of these times, T1, T2, and T3, assign a 16-bit register so that you do not need to do divisions and all kinds of tricks to know where you are. You can know where the terminal count is for each of these times. So for our example, where our time base now is 1 second, we can choose 3 16-bit uint variables, which we call then 5 seconds, T1 10 minutes, and T2 hours. Look at the variable names, they are very self-explanatory. And then we write a check in the logic of the software to detect when 5 seconds has passed. How will we know? Well, our count will have reached the terminal count of 5. Remember, our time base in second, it was chosen to be 1 second. Therefore, 5 counts will equal 5 seconds. Also, when we've reached the terminal count of 600, 10 minutes will have passed, and when we reach terminal count of 7,200, 2 hours have passed. Now, every time that we realize that the time we intend to have passed, we need to reset it back to 0 and need to do whatever we set out to do with that timer. Again, with the 10 minutes, when it's reached, reset it to 0 and do what you intended to do. Check the water level in the dam for overflow. And also in the 2-hour case, reset it to 0 and check the input on the very slow process. Right, so how is this done in practice? Well, in practice, we have to establish the timing ticks, and we can do that by a timer setup like this. And you can see that we have a 1 second delay until this timer turns off. So the output over here will be high for 1 second, and then we have the end of that timer. However, during that time, we use the second comparator line to see if we have exceeded the time that we intend. Now, if one tick is 1 second, then after 500 milliseconds, we reset the variable tick, and that will then have a high to low transition on the off timer, and the off timer will keep running until 1 second has passed. But in half of that time, we will reset that value. So that value will now have a 1 hertz block or square wave waveform. So the period will be 1 second, but every half a second. So this will be high for half a second and low for half a second, so that the period in total is 1 second on that square wave. So we've established that square wave, we've called it tick, and it will have a 1 second period. We can now use that to see when we exceed 5 seconds by counting upwards from 0 to 5, whether we exceed 10 minutes by counting upwards from 0 to 60, and whether we have exceeded 2 hours by counting up from 0 to 7,200. We use the terminal output of the counter to also set this counter. So the moment that we reach the terminal count, we reset this counter, which will take it back to 0. And we then have the upper terminal value to which we count before the reset is done automatically again. What drives this timer is the 1 second tick, and therefore 5 1 second ticks will give you an output over here to enable your process that must run every 5 seconds to start off. And the same with the 10-minute, and the same with the 2-hour process. So we've used this timing ticks technique to times that are longer, considerably longer than a scan cycle, to run slower work than a scan cycle was set up for. Remember, the scan cycle should typically be set up for the fastest work that you need to do in the plant, and then for the slower ones, you can use this timing ticks technique. Now, technique 2 is called multiplexing, and it uses the same piece of code to perform the same function on several processes, which are slower than the scan cycle, by reading and writing different IOs in a series of similar variables, advanced by only one set of IOs per scan cycle. Now, you'll understand what this all means in the next few slides. In each scan cycle, we increment a counter, and input data is read from the input table at the position that is indicated by the counter. The same routine is then performed on this data, and the output placed in the output table at the position indicated by the content of counter. Whenever we write something in this way, we indicate that we are interested in the content of. So that is what the round brackets are for, is to indicate that we are concerned about the content of that variable. So the content of the variable counter indicates both the position at which we read data and the position at which we output data. Now there's some housekeeping to do, because on each scan cycle, we need to increment that counter. And if we have reached the end of the table, we need to reset that counter back to 0. In other words, if we have 10 inputs, once we've read and written all 10, we need to return to the first one again. That's when we reset our counter. Now, the key instructions that are required in using the multiplexing technique are usually known as table to register or register to table commands. Not or, rather, but and. We need these two types of command. Table to register would typically allow us to read various inputs at various addresses and put that into a central register. And register to table would do the opposite. It would allow us to take a value from the register and output it to various output locations. All right. So we have a variable input address in the first one, and we have a variable output address in the second type of instruction. Now, to know where in the tables of input and output to read and write, we need an index, and the index is the address where we currently operate. Now, there's a variety of places where you can use this technique, right? Variety of examples. But one of them is to read the PID constants for various processes as time goes by. All tables must be a series of consecutive locations. You cannot have locations in between that you jump across, etc. They must be consecutive. And on the input side, your input cards must be grouped so that you can access all the inputs you require. And on the output side, all your outputs must be grouped so that you can access all the outputs consecutively. Now remember that because these specific technique or this specific technique allow you to use one set of inputs and outputs in each scan cycle and then advance to a next set of inputs and outputs in the next scan cycle, the process is only repeated once you've gone through the total loop and arrived at the same input again. Therefore, this is only useful for several slow analog processes, which is slower than the scan cycle of your PLC and can be done every n scan cycles, where n can typically be 8 or 16 or 32, because we usually get input modules in quantums of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32 inputs and outputs on one card. So the way in which this multiplexing technique works is that on the input side, according to the content of your index register, you can point to a certain input. And on the output side, you can point to a certain output. In between, you can then execute a function which is the same function for all the inputs and all the outputs. In the next scan cycle, we then want to advance our input by 1 unit and advance our output by 1 unit. So if I click to the next slide, you will see that our pointer goes to the next input and output. And so it continues. Every time we have a scan cycle, we advance until we reach the end, and then we return to the input number 1 again, and we have then the same cycle all over again. So for any input, we execute a function on that, and we output the result to the output that is currently indicated by the index or the content of the index register. You may be more familiar with the multiplexing technique in terms of time division multiplexing that we find in IT, where we can take samples from several inputs and put it in different time slots on our digital communications highway. You can see all the blue processes and all the red processes and all the orange processes, or that may be yellow even, are in different time slots. And then at the receiving side, we unpack from each time slot and send the data towards the intended recipient, so that we have one communal channel in between, and we carry the information from several clients to several destinations. So that's the multiplexing you are more used to perhaps in the IT world, but the multiplexing we have described here uses various input and output modules with the same function in between executed for a set of inputs and a set of outputs every time that the scan cycle runs. So just to repeat, every time a scan cycle runs, in the first scan cycle, we will solicit input from the very first input channel, do a function on it, and then output it to the corresponding output channel. In the next cycle, we will advance that by 1. So in other words, we'll have the second input, take it through the same function, and output it to the second channel. In the third scan cycle, we will read the third input, send it through the function, and output it to the third output. And so it continues until we reach the end, and then we reset to 0 and we start at the beginning again. So this is typically something like a 16 input module, and we start at channel 0 of that module and work our way towards channel 15. And at the bottom, we typically have an output module, and we start at channel 0 and work our way towards channel 15, and then reset to go back to the beginning on both the input and output again. So if this input and outputs are 16-bit bytes, it will take us 16 scan cycles to execute the input and output in this way. And I've said a while ago that we can use this for PID control. So if you have 16 analog input channels and 16 analog output channels, and the function in the center is a PID function, we could run 16 PID loops, one of them each scan cycle across 16 inputs towards 16 outputs. Just remember that you will also have to have program logic so that the 16 PI and D parameters can also be cycled. In other words, if they differ for each of these processes, then you should load a different set of PI and D values for each time this function runs. It is possible. It has been done in projects. Then technique 3 is an encoding decoding technique. And all that means is that we can now compact the data that we need to send. So it is an effort to condense the density of data, more data into a smaller time space. and it assists you in the long-term storage or the efficient transfer across a network to another machine of bitwise data. So if you take 8 bits and group them into 1 byte, for instance, you can have one communication run of 1 byte across a network instead of 8 runs of transferring 1 bit at a time. Remember, most of these networks between PLCs anyways cannot transfer only a single bit. They will, in every instance that you send a bit across, actually send a byte. So all you do now is to package it into a byte before transmitting it, and then at the receiving side, unpack that byte again into different bits so that you only transmit and receive once instead of 8 times. In this example, they show 16 bits condensed into a 16-bit register, transmitted once, and received on the other side into a 16-bit register and unpacked into 16 separate bits again. Right, so these 3 techniques can save you some time, make your programs more compact and more efficient, and therefore they are part of the KISS principle. Next up, we look at programmable automation controllers, PACs, and soft programmable controllers, which is also known as soft PLCs. So what is a programmable automation controller? Well, traditionally, PLCs use a simple scan with limited memory, focus on discrete I/O, and is best suited for machine control, which is simple and high speed. But a programmable automation controller is more geared towards complex automation architectures with a number of PC-based software applications, including human-machine interfaces, asset management, historians, advanced process control, and many others that is possible. In fact, in practice, these two complement each other. It's not that they are in competition with one another. Now, a PAC is a crossbreed between a personal computer, the ones that you typically use as a laptop or as a desktop, but the industrial version of that, and a PLC. So it now offers you the benefits of both devices in a single package. So what are the benefits of both devices? Well, on the PC side, you've got huge processing power. You've got high-level languages, databases, and connectivity that is second to none. And on the PLC side, you've got very robust I/O capabilities of the PLC and specialized I/O and all kinds of things that is very peculiar to PLCs. Now, if you can mix these two, you get programmable automation controllers, and usually PLC vendors now target their higher end systems to be PACs, to incorporate more connectivity options and broader range of control capabilities. So programmable automation controllers are generally a better fit for very extensive process control requirements. They are able to handle large-scale analog I/O, more so typically than PLCs. They are typically used to control controllers. What does that mean? Well, if you have a factory floor with a number of CNC machines or robotic cells, then PACs or PACs are usually good to control the controllers that control the robotics or the cells on the factory floor. They're also very good to transfer data between these machines that they control. And they provide a greater flexibility in their programming, larger memory capacity, and in general, more features and functions. They also have an extensive array of IT type interfaces such as COM ports, USB interfaces. You can have specialized interfaces like HP interface bus, audio interfaces, and a whole host of other specialized interfaces that are typically available on PCs. And they communicate over standard network interface protocols such as TCP/IP or OLE for process control, even mail transfer protocol, which allows them to send email alerts, etc. But on the other hand, your programmable logic controllers has also evolved. From the older PLC, we have now newer PLC architectures that can handle a lot of PID groups more than ever before. And they also have added features and capabilities, including network ports as standard, database connectivity, USB capability. So, what is the message here? Well, PLCs have evolved. They always come near to programmable automation controllers, but they are always just a bit behind the capabilities of a personal computer. And therefore, PACs or programmable automation controllers, which utilizes PCs, usually remains to have the edge. So in our newer generation of PLCs, we see a lot of things that was the domain of PACs only a few years ago, but they have caught up. So our newer PLC generations also feature multiple communication ports, greatly increased memory, communications capability, etc. So sometimes PLC is a better choice, and sometimes programmable automation controllers is a better choice. So when do we choose what? Well, a PLC is a better choice for simple applications, controlling basic kind of machines. For applications consisting primarily of discrete I/O and perhaps a few analog loops, which is typically localized or suited to a central control strategy. Programmable automation, on the other hand, is a better choice to monitor and control a large number of analog I/O points, to do extensive data handling and manipulation, and to control spread across the entire plant or factory floor with distributed I/O and extensive loop control, to run advanced touch control and graphic operator stations, and to enable very rich programming and scientific language environments. So it's very much an either-either situation, with a PAC having the advantage when it comes to connectivity, data handling, etc. Now, in a commercial programmable automation controller environment, you will typically see that they use fanless compact industrial PCs, and sometimes this gets patched with a human machine interface, as in the example center of screen. It's a operator interface integrated with a touch screen, integrated with a fanless industrial PC. They run in highly developed software environments, your typical IT domain of software. They combine PC-based control system with a traditional programmable logic controller type of modules, as can be seen here, with a wide range of capabilities, which include logic, analog control, motion control, machine vision, CCTV, and AI capabilities. And they offer all the best of advanced control, fast I/O, sub-millisecond, and information handling, such as database connectivity, etc. Right, so they typically include things like your Visual Studio environment, incorporating things like C and C++, and even MATLAB and Simulink that can be linked to your control systems. They typically also have a real-time interface, which is sandwiched between the hardware and Windows so that they still retain their real-time capability whilst also enabling all the fancy features of the IT world. Right, so they provide you with a very rich programming language environment coupled to real time. And you will see things like C and C++ programming, all the extended debugging that's available in these environments, all the standard IEC 61131-3. Sorry, I see an error here. That must be -3 languages. And objects that can exchange data and call each other in the language modules that they were written in. They also have non-real-time components, which include .NET programming languages, graphics, HMIs, this is human machine interfaces, and source code management of the same project. And then they provide you with control links to things like MATLAB and Simulink, which gives you a very, very rich environment to operate your control system in. Right, so previously they were on separate paths. Your PLCs developed from relay-based logic, and your embedded controllers developed from industrial PCs. And then your PLC and your embedded environment got married to each other to provide you with programmable automation controller. Their advantages over PLCs are, first of all and uppermost, their more open architecture. Because in the IT world, there are a lot of open architectures, where in the PLC world, there are a lot of proprietary interfaces found. They are modular by design. They've got more analog I/O options, better control capabilities in a lot of aspects. They are designed for tight integration with SQL and other databases. They use a common tag naming that is a common database to integrate all the tags that is used in the system rather than exporting tags from a PLC software environment towards another environment. In programmable automation controllers, you use a common database so that every bit of equipment knows about the tags that is used everywhere. You can achieve a greater I/O capacity in total with more built-in communication ports and capabilities, etc., etc. And then always the far richer programming environment can be found in programmable automation controllers. Right, so this tends to be the same information that was summarized in the previous slide. You can through this on your own. And they also have a very modular architecture. PACS can be found in multi-domain usage, where the same hardware is equally useful as process control, data collection, remote monitoring, discrete and hybrid manufacturing situations. Typically, you find simple to use software that you can easily customize for specific requirements, and use cases include things like facility management systems, environmental monitoring, goods handling, factory automation, smart city, smart campus kind of systems, security awareness systems, which bind CCTV alarms and IoT and data mining into one outcome, namely to be more aware of the security of your plants or buildings, and then also used in advanced research facilities. Here you can see some of the domains. Apologies for the quality of the slide. You can see factory automation, environmental monitoring, machine automation, intelligent transport systems, multiple domains that can be handled by programmable automation control systems. Of course, programmable automation control systems being capable of internet communication can also be extremely widespread so that they are not limited to one building or one plant. They do not need gateways, which is very expensive and difficult to set up sometimes because they have full sets of communication protocols. So a single pack can be used in multiple domains to monitor and manage for quality assurance, for shipping activities, uh, and it can simultaneously manage a lot of technologies that is encompassed, such as analog values, temperatures and pressures, digital on-off stage, serial data from things like RFID and barcode readers, even QR readers, QR codes, network data from test equipment, exchange data with OLAY for process control, support multiple operator interface, run SQL to databases without the need for additional processors, gateways, or middleware. And that is a strong point of programmable automation controllers. Again, you can see here the multiple domain use of such a system. Right, so I'm going to go softly over these slides, which has very much the same information as said before. And then we get to soft PLC architectures. Now, soft PLCs are in fact a version of programmable automation control system that has got a scan cycle, same as a PLC, and is typically sold in the form factor of a PLC, incorporating a industrial PC inside with a operating system, which can typically be something like real-time Linux. You can see runtime executive and embedded Linux connected to all kinds of environments. And this is then called a soft PLC. CodeSys is a very example of a soft PLC because it can run on an industrial PC in a form factor where you can connect modules, etc., same as a PLC. Right, so let's look in the next few slides at high-level language programs and simulations and modelings. And you can see in this slide that in the typical design process of automation, you have requirement analysis, the design of the system, and the implementation of the system. And with the software development process, you will typically have all your IEC 611-3 languages available, which is the 5 languages that we've with elsewhere. And they are then translated typically into programs that is based on the C language. Once the programs are in this stage, they can then be used for simulation and or further downloaded into the PLC, into the soft PLC to run as a program. Now the 5 languages that we spoke of is instructions, structured text, sequential function chart, function block diagram, and ladder diagram, and we have already met these few um, languages. So you can typically see that there are 2 of these languages, structured text and function blocks, which allow you to widely reuse your software. So once you have written your software as a function block, you can export it to the library for use in other projects. And once you've written it in structured text, you can copy and paste it into different environments where it can be reused extensively. Ladder logic um, tend to be not so portable because you cannot readily cut and paste into different environments, as they are not always accepting the format in which it comes from another environment. But function blocks in libraries and structured text that you can copy and paste are highly portable. Next, we look at our PLC software hierarchy, and we see that these 5 languages that is in the standard each have their own domain of applicability. If you look on the horizontal axis, you will see things like analysis, design, and eventually coding of the solution. You will also see that the level of the language is on the vertical axis, from a low level language to a very high level language. And the way in which you need to interpret this diagram now is to say, okay, if I look at the analysis of a system, I cannot really analyze a system with ladder logic. Ladder logic lies more towards the coding of a system. But on the analysis path, I find SFC, or sequential function chart. Now, we have already seen quite a few examples in the tutorials where SFC was used to analyze a process. You can actually draw your process in SFC and then continue to program the functionality in the various steps in something like structured text, which is a high level language, or in one of the lower level languages such as function block diagram, or instruction list, which is low level, or in ladder logic. My personal favorite is to analyze in SFC and then code in structured text. This solution is then rather portable because structured text is highly portable, and the analysis is eased by doing it in SFC. As far as programming languages go, computer sciences has for a long time been in advanced mode, more advanced than PLC programming. PLC programming has picked up and is in the process of modernizing, and somewhere they will meet each other, so that at that spot, which may be a bit in the future, we may have open architectures in total in IT as well as in PLC world, and we will probably have highly portable environments when we reach that stage. But the message is that PLC languages are fast approaching the same high levels than we find in IT-based languages. It's a matter of time. Look at structured text. You will typically see that structured text can be much more compact than ladder logic. We have quite a large space, a requirement to present something in ladder logic. It can be equivalently represented in structured text in a very compact form. State transition diagram is a bit different to sequential function chart in the fact that state transition diagrams are used to represent states of a machine and not steps in a process. So the main difference is that state transition diagram, which is a language found in PLCs like Siemens, more accurately represent the states that the machine can be in, and SFC more accurately relays the process that may be found in an environment. And you can see in the example at the bottom over here that you can have a cylinder in top dead center, in bottom dead center, moving in between either, and you can present that as states, such as top dead center or bottom dead center, or the movement between these two extremes. And these are four states that that cylinder can be in. Nothing to do with a process, but the states of the machine. And this is the same example, just in a larger format. Again, you can see top dead center being represented here, bottom dead center represented over there, and then moving upwards or moving downwards represented by two other states. So if you compare SFC and STD, remember that SFC is more prone to the process and STD more prone to the machine states. So that you will typically, in an analyzing a process, use SFC, and in analyzing a machine, use STD. STD not one of the standard 5 languages, but a very useful language found in the PLC world. So lastly, we need to look at a few specialized programming modules that we find in PLCs. Now, we've already touched on these. We've already spoken about a sequencer, the diagnostic function, and the proportional integral derivative function. Today, we'll be looking more at the programming and examples of that. So let's say you want to write the number in which a process currently finds itself onto a 7-segment display. You can link that 7-segment display to a 16-bit output module and drive it by means of 4 BCD lines per display digit. In other words, every one of these are 4 lines bound together, running binary coded decimal, showing up on the 7-segment display as a decimal number. The combination of the 4 giving you a decimal number is then the step number in the process. So you can use a sequencer to display where you are in the process. So every process step is coded in the 16 bits of a register as BCD code, and this is exactly the process step number that will be displayed on the 4-digit 7-segment display. So if you are at step 1, you will display 1023. If you are at step 2, it needs to display 4576. At step 3, 4588, etc. until step 10. So in order to get that right, you need to enter these numbers in a storage area. The storage area will be in the PLC, will be at register 1000 through 1009, and you specify that in your sequence instruction as your data starts at register 1000 for a length of 10 registers. All right, so now you have to output that on your 16-bit output module. So your 16-bit output module must be, your 16-bit output module must exactly be at address number 7. At address number 7, your output module will be linked to your 7-segment 4-digit display. You start this process by resetting the content of the pointer to 1000, and then for every step of the process you give a pulse on the control line, which will increase the content of pointer from 1000 to 1001, next pulse to 1002, and it will continue until 1009, when you will reach the terminal count, and that will then set the done bit, and the done bit can be used to reset you back to step one if that is a sequence you desire, so that the content of the pointer then returns to 1000 where the first bit of data is written. Right, so another look at the sequencer is then a look at the registers and what each of the registers content says and does, whereas the previous slide was a look at the controls and outputs around the sequencer instruction. So on these two slides, you can then find the controls and outputs and the register explanation of a sequencer. And the example that we have over here then is that you start the process by resetting the content of your pointer to point at the beginning of the table. The pointer will be located in register 2000 and will point to 1000, which is the first entry into your table. When you get a pulse on control, you will increase what is the content of the pointer register to point at 1001. And wherever you point in this block of data, that content will be moved towards position number 7. And at position number 7 is an output module connected to your LEDs, so that the content of that data entry will be displayed on your output LEDs. Right, that's then the sequencer example. The diagnostic example we've also dealt with last week, and it compares a reference set of data, which is the good behavior, with the actual behavior of a machine or a system, and it flags all anomalies that it finds, and the anomaly is then left in a certain register, and you can find the anomaly that occurred between the reference and the actual world in that specific register. Right, so in some instances, you can teach the PLC the normal behavior, and in other instances, the programmer must program the normal operation into a block of data. So some PLCs can auto-learn, whilst others require the programmer to learn what is normal. And then the PID block, as I've last said, the PID block, shown over here is the most basic form of it, where you've got one input saying that you need to enable the PID control. You've got the parameters, you've got the process variable where it's located, so you can continue or proceed to control the analog loop by means of this module. The real world PID control loops look more like the one over here. And you can see there's a plethora of inputs and outputs and registers and options that you can exercise. So there's no way in which we can teach a PID block for every kind of PLC that exists. You will have to do some additional read up, although the basics was given to you in the previous slide over here. That is the core or the essence of a PID block. This is an actual PID block in a PLC, and that concludes our pre-recording for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.